Did an unlikely handshake in the White House just diffuse one of Latin America's most volatile standoffs? Colombian President Gustavo Petro and U.S. President Donald Trump have had their first face-to-face meeting after months of insults, threats, and even talk of military action. What was supposed to be a tense showdown instead produced warm words, cautious optimism, and promises. I'm Marijan Ayandar, and today's newsmaker is US-Colombia relations. Just weeks ago, Washington was accusing Colombia of funneling drugs into the United States and hinted of military action against what Donald Trump called a sick man. Colombia's President Petro, a left-wing ally of Venezuela's Nicolas Maduro, fired back, calling the capture of Maduro illegal and vowing to defend Colombian sovereignty. Now, after their meeting, the two presidents are talking about common priorities, everything from drug trafficking to trade and regional stability. The meeting marks a sharp shift in tone, but not necessarily policy. Here's more on that story.
After months of open confrontation, marked by personal insults and political threats, US President Donald Trump and Colombian President Gustavo Petro came face-to-face at the White House. The meeting was politically unthinkable just weeks earlier and marked a turning point in a relationship that had been heading towards open rupture. What followed is now shaping how Latin America assesses US pressure, diplomacy, and the limits of both. The talks lasted nearly 2 hours and were held behind closed doors. Both leaders later described the meeting as positive, a sharp contrast to the public hostility that had defined their relationship.
We got along very well. He and I weren't exactly the best of friends, but I wasn't insulted because I never met him. I didn't know him at all. And we got along very well, and we're working on that. We're working on some other things too, including sanctions. And we had a very good meeting.
Petro echoed the calmer tone, but framed it as a dialogue, not concession.
I told him that between free people, one cannot act under blackmail. Do this, or else this happens. No, we do not act under blackmail, and I think the photos and the atmosphere of the meeting show a meeting between equals who think differently. Yes, with different powers, obviously, but capable of finding common paths.
The hostility between the two leaders did not begin with rhetoric alone. It was rooted in sharply different approaches to power, security, and intervention in the region. For the Trump administration, drug trafficking has been treated as a national security issue, a framing used to defend forceful action beyond US borders. And that approach was underscored last month by a US operation in Venezuela that led to the detention of President Nicolas Maduro. Petro publicly condemned the move, saying it breached international law and risked destabilizing the region. From there, tensions escalated. Trump accused Colombia of failing to curb cocaine production and questioned Bogota's reliability as a partner. Petro pushed back, insisting sovereignty could not be negotiated away.
Donald Trump is shaking up the world, and that has obviously put everyone on edge. That is why this meeting matters, because Petro has been the only leader who has challenged him on all the important issues.
The meeting may have ended on a measured note, but the differences beneath the surface remain. Washington continues to link cooperation on drug trafficking to sanctions and security pressure. Bogota argues for a different approach, one that targets criminal networks rather than rural communities. And that divide goes beyond policy. It reflects a broader disagreement over power intervention and how far US pressure should reach in Latin America. What unfolded in the Oval Office may look calm. Whether it marked a reset or merely a pause remains an open question.
Joining me now from Bogota, the coordinator at Colombia Risk Analysis, Daniel Poveda, and from Washington, D.C., human rights advocate at the Washington Office on Latin America, Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli. Welcome to the both of you. I want to start off by getting into what this meeting actually achieved, okay? Daniel, let me begin with you. Now that this meeting between President Trump and Gustavo Petro is over, would you describe this as A, a breakthrough, or B, sort of more of a damage control exercise?
Thank you, Alijan, for having me, and thank you to the viewers for tuning in. Well, I think after this months-long escalation of tensions between the two presidents, I do believe that the meeting was kind of a win in avoiding a deterioration or disruption of the bilateral relationship, at least in the short term. And I don't want to suggest that this means that now, as they said yesterday, that President Petro and President Trump are now best friends. They aren't, and the relationship is going to be as fluid as it was yesterday. But I do believe that it is a major achievement in turning around a situation that was getting to a very dangerous point. As we saw last month, we saw President Donald Trump actually threatening with some kind of military action against Colombia, something that would have been unprecedented against, well, a traditional partner for the U.S. in the region. So I do believe, even if it was limited, a very private meeting, details are still emerging on the subjects that they discussed. I do think it was able to be kind of like a turning point for the relationship to at least tolerate each other until the end of President Petro's term.
Fair enough. Daniel. Gimena, do you feel that it was a win in the sense that it wasn't a loss, like Daniel was saying?
Well, I believe that it definitely exceeded expectations. There was a lot of anxiousness and nervousness of what could happen, and the situation was extremely tense. It follows a pattern of negotiation that Trump has been exhibiting globally, which is exerting maximum pressure and then gaining concessions. So in a sense, this meeting, and especially because it was private, allowed both men to be pragmatic, but at the same time save face with their constituencies. But ultimately, the United States is applying its U.S. security strategy, national security strategy, which is basically a corollary of the Monroe Doctrine that includes advancing U.S. interests in the region, in particular narco trafficking and economic interests and access to energy resources.
Okay, Gimena, let me follow up by asking. So, I mean, this was a private meeting, as both of you have stated. Details are still coming out, but the fact is that human rights groups were watching this meeting closely. Do you see any signs that sort of human rights and Colombia's peace process featured in any meaningful way in these talks between the two presidents?
At this point, no. But I think that the fact that they reopened dialogue gives an opportunity for that to become part of the discussion moving forward. The reality is that the lessons learned over more than 20 years of counter-narcotics engagement between both countries is that the purely military security approach does not work in diminishing narco trafficking or dismantling illegal armed groups. A big lesson of Plan Colombia is that you need to have a socioeconomic integral approach. The peace 2016 signed, although imperfect, starts a framework that goes in that direction. So I think if they really want to have results, they're going to have to start talking that way. At the same time, although most cooperation was zeroed out, and Colombia being the country that received the most from the U.S. in the region was worst affected, it is likely that we are going to see a restart of cooperation now that the State Department has been reorganized and USAID has been dismantled. So it may be addressed in a different way. And within those discussions, I do believe that we're going to start hearing about whether or not there'll be support for the peace process and what sorts of human rights issues might be supported. More than likely, it's probably going to be free and fair elections, more in that front than individual and collective rights.
Daniel, a response to some of the things that Gimena brought up?
Yeah, well, I have to agree with most of the points with Gimena. I do believe that, I mean, human rights wasn't really much of kind of like a central point for the meeting yesterday. At least we haven't actually been able to make sure that that was a topic for both presidents. However, I do think that, I mean, for the Colombian president and for President Trump in the United States, as Jimena said, both of them were able to talk to the constituents. So at least on the Colombian side, I see that there was this eagerness by President Petro to be able to tell citizens here in Colombia, tell them, you know what, we got to eliminate the middleman. We got to talk to Trump directly, and it isn't this far right establishment in Colombia that usually talks towards the United States. So he got to say that, you know, when we get to see each other face to face and to actually talk between the two, we get to certain arrangements, certain agreements. You know, that's something that's very important for President Petro here in Colombia. He's been trying to transmit that message in the past months, saying that he's been mischaracterized towards the American administration. So I think that's something that's very important for the Colombian side. We know that President Petro was very interested in also getting some personal concessions from President Trump. We're not sure what the progress on that is going to be. For example, the sanctions on him on being on the OFAC list, together with other prominent members of the cabinet, such as Interior Minister Armando Benedetti and his wife, Veronica Alcocer. So these are also other goals that we know were part of President Petro's agenda, but we're not sure how promptly he's going to be able to get some kind of concession on that. And for President Trump, he got to be able to turn around this situation as well and say that he got to sit down with President Petro, discuss drug trafficking, and we see a very different tone that we've been seeing on the past month. When not so long ago, we saw President Trump talking about President Petro and describing him as a drug leader, saying he will be next, threatening with some kind of action after U.S. intervention in Venezuela a month ago. So what I see is, as Jimena also suggested, is that President Trump has used this kind of strategy towards Latin America, saying, you know, kind of like threatening with the most extreme option, but then at the end, sometimes playing out on it as it happened with Venezuela, but then at the end, gathering some concessions from other American leaders. And I think the Colombian case is very different to Venezuela, and I still believe that kind of these drastic measures against Colombia are very unlikely in the short term. I think that's due to two reasons, particularly. First of all, I think the involvement of Secretary of State Marco Rubio. He's very aware of Latin American politics. He knows Colombian politics as well. He knows there's an upcoming election in Colombia, and that President Petro is, he doesn't have, he goes until August 7th, and that his successor, whoever the Colombians elect in the upcoming elections, is most likely to be more aligned with the Trump administration than the Petro administration currently is. So I think these are the two aspects of having a Latin American expert, and also knowing that it's very risky to actually give up on such a strategic ally at this point, knowing that they'll probably get some kind of a working relationship with whoever replaces President Gustavo Petro. So I think both of them were able to speak directly to their constituents. I think for President Petro it was very important because he noticed that kind of like rallying up this anti-American sentiment here in Colombia wasn't going to be as effective for the upcoming elections as they thought.
Okay.
So
Daniel, let me ask you.
Pragmatic road.
Let me ask you. You said that there aren't a lot of similarities with Venezuela. You've also said that direct military action against Colombia isn't very likely. But does that the rhetoric itself still function as perhaps a coercive tool to force President Gustavo Petro into aligning more with Washington?
Yes, Aljan, I agree completely. It's become kind of like this very recurrent tool in handling relations with other allies as well. And this, as I said before, is very unprecedented in the relationship between the U.S. and Colombia. Threatening with some kind of military action or some kind of action against the leader is a dangerous precedent. I don't believe that this is how the relations between Colombia and the U.S. should actually work. But we've seen this from the beginning of President Trump's term, right? We had this sort of diplomatic crisis right at the beginning of Trump's term when President Petro did not accept handcuffed migrants that had been deported back to Colombia, and then President Trump and his administration threatened with sanctions against the country, tariffs, as well as other measures against the president. That crisis was able to be they found a solution to that crisis, but then we've seen some actions against Colombia that obviously have deteriorated the relationship in a very significant manner. The first one was that crisis, but then we saw later in the year the decertification of Colombia as an anti-drug ally, taking into account what Gimena mentioned of Colombia being a major ally for the US in all of these anti-drug efforts. So we saw that decision, which also slashes cooperation with decisions on USAID as well here in Colombia. And then finally, we see President Petro's visa revoked after very provocative words and speech in New York. But then we see these sanctions on President Petro, his wife, and members of his cabinet. So we're seeing this escalation of tensions as well, if you include also all of these mentions on social media that haven't been in the nicest terms. So for the incoming government here in Colombia, as you said, the next administration is very likely to inherit and have to absorb the political cost of these commitments with Washington, of this fragile relationship with Washington, and particularly having to take a position on counter-narcotics policy, security cooperation. And we haven't talked about it that much from the meeting, but also some kind of distancing on China. It seemed it wasn't as important of a topic yesterday, but these are going to have to be these discussions, as well as on migration, that the next president is going to have to take a very clear position on whether he wants to ally with the Trump administration.
Fair enough. Daniel, thanks for that. Gimena, so some of the themes that Daniel was mentioning was obviously you mentioned as well, the narco trafficking, and towards the end of his answer, the government inheriting the political cost. So let me ask you, I mean, since you're in D.C., from a U.S. perspective, what were some of the real priorities for this meeting? I mean, was it about restoring working channels on drugs and security, rather than resolving deeper political differences?
I think there were a lot of domestic politics as well as regional issues that really were behind the decision to take this meeting and to advance in this direction on the part of the Trump administration. One is that one of Trump's major promises to his MAGA base was that he wasn't going to be putting American service members in harm's way. And already with the whole buildup in the Caribbean and the military intervention, although they don't call it a military intervention, they call it a police operation in Caracas, they were pushing that promise and causing a lot of concern. That's why they exalted so much the idea that no American service member was killed, although others were, Cubans and Venezuelans, as well as civilians, including Colombians, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is that, so they couldn't afford really to go into Colombia, which would have been a much trickier situation given the multiplicity of illegal armed groups there and what have you. And then second, they need Colombia because the ELN guerrillas, which are narco traffickers and involved in illicit economies, are really a binational guerrilla. They're in 8 states within Venezuela, as well as throughout the whole border on the Colombian side, and they've been upping operations in the past year against their adversaries. And so getting into that whole mess, I think that it's very clear that they needed Colombia. The other thing that is looming is that they've increased pressure on Cuba with economic restrictions and what have you. And the reality is that Secretary Marco Rubio, who was also in the room, which was a big signal, right? The big interest is to change the regime in Cuba. The interest was to push Maduro out, but then also change the regime in Cuba. And so while Colombia at this time is friendly with Cuba, I think that they needed to start engagement there to sort of stop any sort of real opposition to that beyond rhetoric. At the same time, domestic politics are kind of a mess in the United States. Things are incredibly polarized. And we saw that there was a partial government shutdown because of disagreement over legislative budget that had to do with the agency that oversees ICE and Customs and Border Patrol.
Hmm.
And so I think they didn't want to take on too many fights at once, and it was easier just to figure out a way to, as Danielle said, smooth things over until the next administration. They're really thinking about the next administration
Okay.
in Colombia.
Let me ask you about the peace efforts in Colombia, Gimena. I mean, we know that the United States has criticized the negotiations by the current government with the armed groups, especially when you look at the eradication process. Could increased U.S. pressure sort of undermine what Colombia is trying to do?
Okay, well, first, the U.S. has already undermined Colombia. It was the #1 donor to the 2016 Colombia peace agreement and the #1 partner on anti-narcotics support, not just the military side and the hardware side, but also the economic cooperation needed that goes with the intelligence and everything else. Okay, so they've already undermined their own interests. Secondly, it's really important to highlight that the support for the peace agreement did not happen in a vacuum. For over 200 years, Colombia has had a bipartisan relationship with Colombia. It's always been the model where no matter who's in government in Colombia, who's in government in the United States, they work together and they work things out, right? And so one thing that happened when Juan Manuel Santos came into government was that they started to move towards an economic and package that looked at the multiplicity of the root causes of narco trafficking, of impunity, of everything that helps build illicit economies. And you had even congressional reports, bipartisan congressional reports saying that this military approach didn't work. And so I think that they know that. And so they know that they need to go back to something like that.
Mm-hmm.
Obviously, they've taken this aggressive boat strikes approach that one elephant in the room was, what's going to happen with that going forward? If there is cooperation, obviously Petro has been extremely opposed to it, and Colombia was the country that brought the issue before the UN Security Council with the support of Russia and China. But basically what I'm saying is they're really reverting back to what is more likely to work, but trying to save face with this meeting. On fumigations, prior to this meeting, already there was an upping on terrestrial fumigations with glyphosate. Secretary Marco Rubio, as senator and now as secretary, has always been pretty obsessed with restarting fumigation efforts. And I think that there's going to be pressure to increase that in some way. And I believe that there may have been some discussion on already trying to meet certain targets in terms of coca crop destruction.
Okay. Daniel, if I can get sort of your comments on what Gimena said, and also sort of maybe follow up on your comment on this government sort of waiting out to the end of the presidency rather than sort of rebuilding trust.
Of course, there's a very interesting point that Gimena mentioned on a little bit on how the region is also receiving the Trump administration's policy, specifically with this campaign against alleged drug boats in the Caribbean and the Pacific. And there, I think there's a point that's very important for President Petro as well, and that might be a source of tension in the near term. If this campaign continues, specifically if it continues without overt Colombian collaboration or cooperation, well, we've seen a President Petro that's very critical of what he calls foreign intervention in the region. And what's even more worrisome is the fact that President Petro hasn't been able to portray himself because he's interested in being that fearless Latin American leader that gets all these Latin American countries together to reject U.S. intervention in the region. But he hasn't been successful in doing that. And when he's also brought up these meetings between Latin American and Caribbean countries. They haven't been able to give up a joint statement on this. And this rejection, I mean, the Trump policy in the region has divided these nations on actually gathering up a unified stance, whether against or in favor of this kind of relationship with the U.S. and with the Trump administration. So this is something that's very important of what I noted on Gimena's comments. Obviously, and I think you've asked me on the electoral process as well, and I'd like to also pick up on the future of kind of like the strategy towards armed groups. With President Petro, we had this total peace policy, which was sitting down with all armed groups at once simultaneously and trying to get to agreements with them. And now in his fourth year, we've noticed that, well, it seems like these results aren't going to, it isn't going to happen, right? So the incoming president is going to have kind of like a mandate to actually reconsider this approach towards armed groups and actually maybe having a hardline approach towards them instead of having, at least at the beginning of his term, having a dialogue approach.
Fair enough. Daniel Poveda and Gimena Sanchez-Garzoli, thank you very much for joining us here on this episode of the Newsmakers. And thanks to you for watching. Of course, you can follow us on social media and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. For now, I'm Ali Janayandash, and we'll see you next time.